Hello and welcome to part 6 of Coming Up for Hair reading, novel by George Orwell. We begin our reading on part 2 and chapter 7 of part 2. That's all really. I've tried to tell you something about the world before the war, and the world I got a sniff of when I saw King Zog's name on the poster, and the chances are that I've told you nothing. Either you remember before the war and don't need to be told about it, or you don't remember and it's no use telling you. So far, I've only spoken about the things that happened to me before I was 16. Up to that time, things had gone pretty well with the family. It was a bit before my 16th birthday that I began to get glimpses of what people call real life, meaning unpleasantness. After 3 days after I'd seen the big carp at Binfield House, Father came in to tea looking very worried and very more grey and mealy than usual. He ate his way solemnly through his tea and didn't talk much. In those days he had a rather preoccupied way of eating, and his mustache used to work up and down with a sidelong movement, because he hadn't many back teeth left. I was just getting up from table when he called me back. "Wait a minute, George, my boy. I got something to say to you. Sit down just a minute. Mother, you heard what I got to say last night." Mother, behind the huge brown teapot, folded her hands in her lap and looked solemn. Father went on speaking, very seriously, but rather spoiling the effect by trying to deal with a crumb that lodged somewhere in what was left of his back teeth. "George, my boy, I got something to say to you. I've been thinking it over, and it's about time you left school. 'Fraid you'll have to get to work and start earning a bit of bring home to your mother. I wrote to Mr. Wixey last night and told him, as I should have, to take you away." Of course, this was quite according to precedent, his writing to Mr. Wixey before telling me, I mean. Parents in those days, as a matter of course, always arranged things over their children's heads. Father went on to say some rather mumbling and worried explanations. He'd had bad times lately. Things had been a bit difficult, and the upshot was that Joe and I would have to start earning our living. At that time, I didn't either know or greatly care whether the business was really in bad way or not. I hadn't even enough commercial instinct to see the reason why things were difficult. The fact was that Father had been hit by competition. Sarzens, the big retail seedsman who had branches all over the home countries, had stuck a tentacle into lower Binfield. 6 months earlier, they'd taken the lease of a shop in the marketplace and dolled it up until, what with bright green paint, gilt lettering, and gardening tools painted red and green, and huge advertisements for sweet peas, it hit you in the eye at 100-yard distance. Saracens, besides selling flower seeds, described themselves as universal poultry and livestock providers, and apart from wheat and oats and so forth, they went in for patent poultry mixtures, bird seed done up in fancy packets, dog biscuits of all shapes and colors, medicines and brocations and conditionings powders, and branched off into such things as rat traps, dog chains, incubators, sanitary eggs, bird nesting bulbs, weed killer, insecticide, and even some branches into what they called a livestock department, meaning rabbits and day-old chicks. Father, with his dusty old shop and his refusal to stock new lines, couldn't compete with that kind of thing and didn't want to. The tradesmen, with their van horses, and such of the farmers as dealt with the retail seedsmen, fought shy of Saracens. But in 6 months they'd gathered in the petty gentry of the neighborhood, who in those days had carriages of dog carts and therefore horses. This meant a big loss of trade for Father and the other corn merchants, Winkle. I didn't grasp any of this at the time. I had a boy's attitude toward it all. I'd never taken my interest in the business. I'd never or hardly ever served in the shop, and when, as occasionally happened, Father wanted me to run an errand or give a hand with something, such as hoisting sacks of grain up to the loft or down again, I'd always dodged it whenever possible. Boys in our class aren't such complete babies as public school boys. They know the work is work and sixpence is sixpence, but it seems natural for a boy to regard his father's business as a bore. Up till that was fishing rods, bicycles, fizzy lemonade, and so forth had seemed to me a good deal more real than anything that happened in the grown-up world. Father had already spoken to old Grimmett, the grocer, who wanted a smart lad that was willing to take me into the shop immediately. Meanwhile, Father was going to get rid of the errand boy, and Joe was to come home and help with the shop till he got a regular job. Joe had left school some time back and had been more or less loafing ever since. Father had sometimes talked of getting him into the accounts department at the brewery, and earlier had even had thought of making him into an auctioneer. Both were completely hopeless because Joe, at 17, rode a hand like a plowboy and couldn't repeat the multiplication table. At present, he was supposed to be learning the trade at a bicycle shop on the outskirts of Walton. Tinkering with bicycles suited Joe, who, like most half-wits, had a slight mechanical turn, but he was quite incapable of working steadily, and spent all his time loafing about in the greasy overalls, smoking woodbines, getting into fights, drinking — he's started that already — getting talked off with one girl after another, and sticking Father for money. Father was worried, puzzled, and vaguely resentful. I could see him yet, with the meal on his bald head, and the bit of gray hair over his ears, and his spectacles and his gray mustache. He couldn't understand what was happening to him. For years his profits had gone up, slowly and steadily, £10 this year, £20 that year, and now suddenly they'd gone down with a bump. He couldn't understand it. He inherited the business from his father. He'd done an honest trade, worked hard, sold sound goods, swindled nobody, and his profits were going down. He said a number of times, between sucking at his teeth to get a crumb out, that times were very bad. Trade seemed very slack. He couldn't think what had come over people. It wasn't as if the horses didn't have to eat. Perhaps it was the motors, he decided finally. Nasty, smelly things, Mother put it. She was a little worried, and knew that she ought to be more so. Once or twice while Father was talking, there was a far-away look in her eyes, and I couldn't see her lips moving. She was trying to decide whether it should be a round of beef and carrots tomorrow or another leg of mutton, except when there was something in her own line that needed foresight, such as buying linen or saucepans. She wasn't really capable of thinking beyond tomorrow's meals. The shop was giving trouble, and Father was worried. That was about as far as she saw into it. None of us had any grasp of what was happening. Father had had a bad year and had lost money, but was he really frightened by the future? I didn't think so. This was 1909, remember. He didn't know what was happening to him. He wasn't capable of foreseeing that these Saracen people would systematically undersell him, ruin him, and eat him up. How could he? Things hadn't happened like that when we was a young man. All he knew was the times were bad, trade was very slack, very slow. He kept repeating these phrases, but probably things would look up presently. It wouldn't be nice if I could tell you that I was a great help to my father in his time of trouble, suddenly proved myself a man, and developed qualities which no one had suspected in me, and so on and so forth. Like the stuff you used to read in the uplift novels of 30 years ago, or alternatively, I'd like to be able to record that I bitterly resented having to leave school. My eager young mind, yearning for knowledge and refinement, recoiled from the soulless mechanical job into which they were thrusting me. And so on and so forth, like the stuff you read in the uplift novels today. Both would be completely bunkum. The truth is that I was pleased and excited at the idea of going to work, especially when I grasped the old Grimmett was going to pay me real wages, 12 shillings a week, of which I could keep 4 of myself. The big carp at Binfield House, which had filled my mind for 3 days past, faded right out of it. I'd no objection to leaving school a few terms early. It generally happened the same way the boys at our school. A boy was always going to go to Reading University, or study, or be an engineer, or going to business in London, or run away to sea, and then suddenly, at 2 days' notice, he'd disappear from school, and a fortnight later you'd meet him on a bicycle, delivering vegetables. Within 5 minutes of Father telling me that I should have to leave school, I was wondering about the new suit I should wear to go to work. I instantly started demanding a grown-up suit with a kind of coat that was fashionable at the time, a cutaway, I think it was called. Of course, both Mother and Father were scandalized and said they'd never heard of such things. For some reason that I've never fully fathomed, parents in those days always tried to prevent their child wearing grown-up clothes as long as possible. In every family, there was a stand-up fight before a boy had his first tall collars or a girl put her hair up. So the conversation veered away from father's business troubles and degenerated into a long, nagging kind of argument, with father gradually getting angry and repeating over and over, dropping an ache now and again, as he was apt to when he got angry. Well, you can't have it. Make your mind to that. You can't have it. So I don't have my cutaway, but went to work for the first time in a ready-made black suit and a broad collar in which I looked an overgrown loot. Any distress I felt over the whole business really arose from that. Joe was even more selfish about it. He was furious at having to leave the bicycle shop, and for the short time that he remained at home, he merely loafed about, made a nuisance of himself, and was no help to father whatever. I worked in old Grimmett's shop for nearly 6 years. Grimmett was a fine, upstanding, white-whiskered old chap, like a rather stouter version of Uncle Ezekiel, and like Uncle Ezekiel, a good liberal. But he was less of firebrand and more respected in the town. He trimmed his sails during the Boer War, and he was a bitter enemy of trade unions, and once sacked an assistant for possessing a photograph of Keir Hardie, and he was chapel, in fact, was a big nose, literally, in the Baptist church, known locally as the Tin Tab, whereas my family were church, and the Uncle Ezekiel was an infidel infidel. Old Grimmett was a town councillor and an official at the local Liberal Party. With his white whiskers, his canting talk about liberty or of consciousness, and the grand old man is thumping back balance, and the extempore prayers that could sometimes hear him letting loose when you passed in the Tin Tab, he was a little like a legendary nonconformist grocer in the story. You heard it, I expect. James: Yes, sir. Have you standed the sugar? Yes, sir. Have you watered the trestle? Yes, sir. Then come up to prayers. God knows how many times I heard that story whispered in the shop. He did actually start the day with a prayer before we put up the shutters. Not that old Grimmett sanded the sugar. He knew that doesn't pay. But he was a sharp man in business. He did all the high-class grocery trade of Lower Binfield and the country round, and he had 3 assistants in the shop beside the errand boy, the van man, and his own daughter. He was a widower who acted as cashier. I was the errand boy for my first 6 months. Then one of the assistants left to set up in reading, and I moved into the shop and wore my first white apron. I learned to tie a parcel pack of bag of currants, grind coffee, work the bacon slicer, carve ham and put an edge on a knife, sweep the floor, dust eggs without breaking them, pass off an inferior article as a good one, clean a window, judge a pound of cheese by eye, open a packing case, whack a slab of butter into shape, and, what was a good deal the hardest, remember where the stock was kept. I haven't such detailed memories of grocerying as I have of fishing, but I remember a good deal. To this day, I know the trick of snapping a bit of string in my fingers. If you put me in front of a bacon slicer, I could work it better than I can a typewriter. I could spin you some pretty fair technicalities about grades of China tea, and what margarine is made of, and the average weight of eggs, and the price of paper bags per 1,000. Well, for more than 5 years, that was me, an alert young chap with a round, pink, snubby kind of face and butter-colored hair, no longer cut short, but carefully greased and slicked back in what people used to call a smarm, hustling about behind the counter in a white apron with a pencil behind my ear, trying up bags of coffee like lightning and jockeying the customer along with, "Yes, ma'am," "Certainly, ma'am," and "The next order, ma'am," in a voice which was the trace of a Cockney accent. Old Grimmett worked us pretty hard. It was an 11-hour day except on Thursday and Sunday, and Christmas week was a nightmare. Yet it's good time to look back on. Don't think that I had no ambitions. I knew I wasn't going to retain a grocer's assistant forever. I was merely learning the trade. Somehow or other, there'd be enough money for me to set up on my own. That was how people felt in those days. This was before the war, remember, and before the slumps, and before the dole. The world was big enough for everyone. Anyone could set up in trade. There was always room for another shop, and time was slipping. On 1909, 1910, 1911, King Edward died, and the papers came out with a black border around the edge. 2 cinemas opened in Walton, and the cars got commoner on the road, and the cross-country motor buses began to run. An aeroplane, a flimsy, rickety-looking thing with a chap sitting in the middle of on a kind of chair, flew over Lower Binfield, and the whole town rushed out of their houses to yet at it. People began to say rather vaguely that this here German emperor was getting too big for his boots, and it, meaning war with Germany, was coming some time. My wages went gradually up until finally, just before the war, they were 28 shillings a week. I paid Mother 10 shillings a week for my board, and later, when times got worse, 15 shillings, and even that left me feeling richer than I had ever felt since. I grew another inch. My mustache began to sprout. I wore button boots and collars 3 inches high. In church on Sundays, in my natty dark gray suit, with my bowler hat and my black dogskin gloves on the pew beside me, I looked the pretty gent, so that Mother could hardly contain her pride in me. In between work and walking out on Thursday and thinking about clothes and girls, I had fits of ambition and saw myself developing into a big businessman like Lever or William Whiteley. Between 16 and 18, I had made serious efforts to improve my mind and train myself for a business career. I cured myself of dropping aches and got rid of most of my Cockney accent. In the Thames Valley, the country accent was going out. Except for the farm lads, nearly everyone who had born later than 1890 talked Cockney. I did a correspondence course with Littleburn's Commercial Academy, learnt bookkeeping and business English, read solemnly through a book of frightful blah called The Art of Salesmanship, and improved my arithmetic and even my handwriting. When I was as old as 17, I sat up late at night with my tongue hanging out of my mouth, practicing copper plate by the little oil lamp on the bedroom table. At times I read enormously, generally crime and adventure stories, and sometimes paper-covered books which were furtively passed around by chaps at the shop and described as hot. There were translations of Maupassant and Paul de Kock. But when I was 18, I suddenly turned highbrow, got a tick for the country library, and began to stodge through books by Mary Corelli and Hall Caine and Anthony Hope. It was at about that time that I joined the Lower Binfield Reading Circle, which was run by the vicar and met one evening a week all through the winter for what was called literary discussion. Under pressure from the vicar, I read bits of Sesame and Lilies, and even had a go at Browning. And time was slipping away, 1910, 1911, 1912, and Father's business was going down, not slumping suddenly into the gutter, but it was going down. Neither Father nor Mother was ever quite the same after Joe ran away from home. This happened not long after I went to work at Grimmett's. Joe, at 18, had grown into an ugly ruffian. He was a hefty chap, much bigger than the rest of the family, with tremendous shoulders, a big head, and a sulky, lowering kind of face, on which he hardly had a respectable mustache. When he wasn't in the tap room of the George, he was loafing in the shop doorway, with his hands dug deep into his pockets, scowling at the people who passed. Except when they happened to be girls, he thought he'd like to knock them down. If anyone came into the shop, he'd move aside just enough to let them pass, and without taking his hand out of his pockets, he'd yell over his shoulders, "Da shop." This was as near as he ever got to helping. Father and Mother said despairingly that they didn't know what to do with him, and he was coasting the devil of a lot with the drinking and endless smoking. Late one night he walked out of the house and was never heard of again. He prized open the till and taken all the money that was in it. Luckily not much, about £8. That was enough to get him a steerage passage to America. He'd always wanted to go to America, and I think he probably did so, though we never knew for certain. It was a bit of scandal in the town. The official theory was that Joe had bolted because he'd put a girl in the family way. There was a girl named Sally Shivels, Shivers, who lived in the same street at the Simmonses and was going to have a baby, and Joe had certainly been with her, but so had about a dozen others, and nobody knew whose baby it was. Mother and father accepted the baby theory, and even, in private, used it to excuse their poor boy for stealing the 8 pounds and running away. They weren't capable of grasping that Joe had cleared out because he couldn't stand a decent, respectable life in a little country town and wanted a life of loafing, fights, and women. We never heard of him again. Perhaps he went utterly to the bad. Perhaps he was killed in the war. Perhaps he merely didn't bother to write. Luckily, the baby was born dead, so there was no complications. As for the fact that Joe had stolen the 8 pounds, mother and father managed to keep it a secret till they died. In their eyes, it was much worse disgrace than Sally Shiver's baby. The trouble over Joe aged father a great deal. To lose Joe was merely a loss, but it hurt him and made him ashamed. From the time forward, his mustache was much grayer and seemed to have grown a little smaller. Perhaps my memory of him as a little gray man with a round-lined, anxious face and dusty spectacles really dates from the time. By slow degrees, he was getting more and more involved in money, worried less and less interest in other things. He talked less about politics in the Sunday papers and more about the badness of trade. Mother seemed to have shrunk a little too. In my childhood, I'd known her as something vast and overflowing, with her yellow hair and her beaming face and her enormous bosom, a sort of great opulent creature like a figurehead of a battleship. Now she'd gotten smaller and more anxious and older than her years. She was less lordly in her kitchen, went in more for neck of mutton, worried over the price of coal, and began to use margarine, a thing which in the old days she'd never had allowed into the house. After Joe had gone, father had to hire an errand boy again, but from then on he employed very young boys who he only kept for a year or two and who couldn't lift heavy weights. I sometimes lent him a hand when I was at home. I was too selfish to do it regularly. I can still see him working his way slowly across the yard, bent double and almost hidden under an enormous sack, like a snail under its shell. The huge, monstrous sack, weighing 150 pounds, I suppose, pressed his neck and shoulders almost to the ground, and the anxious, spectacled face looked up from underneath it. In 1911, he ruptured himself and had to spend weeks in a hospital and hire a temporary manager for the shop, which ate another hole in his capital. A small shopkeeper going down the hill is a dreadful thing to watch, but it isn't sudden and obvious like the fate of a working man who gets a sack and promptly finds himself on the dole. It's just a gradual chipping away of trade, with little ups and downs, a few shillings to the bad here, and a few sixpence to the good there. Somebody who's dealt with you for years suddenly deserts and goes to Saracens. Nobody else buys a dozen hens and gives you a weekly order for corn. You can still keep going. You're still your own master, and always a little more worried and a little shabbier, with your capital shrinking all the time. You can go on like that for years, for a lifetime if you're lucky. Uncle Ezekiel died in 1911, leaving 120 pounds, which must have been a lot of difference to father. It was till 1913 that he had to mortgage his life insurance policy, that I didn't hear about at the time, or I'd have understood what it meant. As it was, I didn't think I ever got further than realizing that father was doing well. Trading was slack. There's a bit longer to wait before I had the money to set up. Like father himself, I looked on the shop as something permanent, and I was a bit inclined to be angry with him for not managing things better. I wasn't capable of seeing, and neither was he nor anyone else, that he was being slowly ruined, and his business would never pick up again, and if he lived to be 70, he'd certainly end in the workhouse. Many a time I've passed Sarrazin's shop in the marketplace and merely thought how much I preferred their slick window front to father's dusty old shop, with the S. Bowling, which you could hardly read, the chipped white lettering, and the faded packets of birdseed. It didn't occur to me that Sarrazins were tapeworms who were eating him alive. Sometimes I used to repeat it to him, some of the stuff I'd been reading in my correspondence course textbooks about salesmanship and modern methods. He never paid much attention. He inherited an old established business. He'd always worked hard, done a fair trade, and supplied sound goods, and things would look up presently. It's a fact that very few shopkeepers in those days actually ended in the workhouse. With any luck, you'd die with a few pounds still to your own. It was a race between death and bankruptcy. And thank God, death got father first, and mother too. 1911, 1912, 1913. I tell you, it was a good time to be alive. It was late in 1912, though the vicar's reading circle that I first met Elsie Waters. Till then, although, like all the rest of the boys in the town, I'd gone out looking for girls and occasionally managed to connect up with the girl or that, and walked out a few Sunday afternoons, I'd never really had a girl of my own. It's a queer business, the chasing of girls when you're about 16. At some recognized part of the town, the boys stroll up and down in pairs, watching the girls, and the girls stroll up and down in pairs, pretending not to notice the boys, and presently some kind of contract is established. Instead of twos, they're trailing along in fours, all four utterly speechless. The chief feature of those walks, and it was worse the second time, when you went out with the girl alone, was the ghastly failure to make any kind of conversation. But Elsie Waters seemed different. The truth was that I was growing up. I didn't want to tell the story of myself and Elsie Waters. Even if there was a story to tell, it's merely that she's part of the picture, before the war. Before the war, it was always summer. A delusion, as I've remarked before, but that's how I remember it. The white dusty road stretched out between the chestnut trees and smell of night stalks. The green pools under the willows, and the splash of Buford weirs. That's what I see when I shut my eyes and think of before the war. And towards the end, Elsie Waters is part of it. I don't know whether Elsie would be considered pretty now. She was then. She was tall for a girl and about as tall as I am, with pale gold heavy kind of hair which she wore somehow plaited and coiled round her head, and a delicate, curiously gentle face. She was one of those girls that always looked their best in black, especially the very plain black dresses they made them wear in drapery. She worked at Lily White's the drapers, though she came originally from London. I suppose she would have been 2 years older than I was. I'm grateful to Elsie because she was the first person who taught me to care about a woman. I don't mean woman in general, I mean an individual woman. I'd met her at the reading circle and hardly noticed her, and then one day I went into Lily White's during work hours, a thing I wouldn't normally have been able to do, but as it happened, we'd run out of butter muslin, and old Grimmett sent me to buy some. You know the atmosphere of Draper's shop. It's sometimes peculiarly feminine. There's a hushed feeling, a subbed light, a cool smell of cloth, and a faint whirling from the wooden balls of change rolling to and fro. Elsie was leaning against the counter, cutting off a length of cloth with big scissors. There was something about her black dress and the curve of her breast against the counter. I can't describe it, something curiously soft, cushiony, feminine. As soon as you saw her, you knew that you could take her in back your arms and do what you wanted with her. She was really deeply feminine, very gentle, very submissive, the kind that would always do what a man told her, though she wasn't either small or weak. She wasn't even stupid, only rather silent and at times dreadfully refined. But in those days, I was rather refined myself. We were living together for about a year. Of course, in a town like Lower Binfield, you could only live together in a figurative sense. Officially, we were walking out, which was a recognized custom and not quite the same as being engaged. There was a road that branched off from the road to Upper Binfield and ran along under the edge of the hills. There was a long stretch of it, nearly a mile, that was quite straight and fringed with enormous horse chestnut trees, and on the grass at the side there was a footpath under the boughs, and was known as Lover's Lane. We used to go there on the May's evenings, when the chestnuts were in blossom. Then the short nights came on, and it was light for hours after we'd left the shop. You know the feeling of a June evening, the kind of blue twilight that goes on, and the air brushing against your face like silk. Sometimes on Sunday afternoons we went over Chamford Hill and down to the water meadows along the Thames. 1913, my God, 1913, the stillness, the green water, the rushing of the weirs, it'll never come again. I don't mean that 1913 will never come again. I mean the feeling inside you, the feeling of being in a hurry and not being frightened, the feeling you'd never had and don't need to be told about, or haven't had and won't even have the chance to learn. It wasn't till late summer that we began what's called living together. It had been too shy and clumsy to begin, and too ignorant to realize that there'd been others before me. One Sunday afternoon, we went into the beech woods round Upper Binfield. Up there, you could always be alone. I wanted her very badly, and I knew quite well that she was only waiting for me to begin. Something I didn't know what put into my head, to go into the grounds of Binfield House. Old Hodges who was past 70 and getting very crusty, was capable of turning us out, but he'd probably be asleep on a Sunday afternoon. We slipped through a gap in a fence and down the footpath between the beeches to this big pool. It was about 4 years or so more since I'd been that way. Nothing had changed, still the utter solitude, the hidden feeling, with the great trees all around you, the old boat house rotting among the bulrushes. We lay down in the little green hollow beside the wild peppermint, and we were as much alone as if we'd been in Central Africa. I'd kissed her God knows how many times, and then I got up and was wandering about again. I wanted her very badly and wanted to take the plunge. Only I was half frightened, and curiously enough, there was another thing in my mind at the same time. It suddenly struck me for that years I meant to come back here and had never come. Now I was so near, it seemed a pity not to go down into the pool and have a look at the big carp. I felt I'd kick myself afterwards if I missed the chance. In fact, I couldn't think why I hadn't been back before. The carp were stored away in my mind. Nobody knew about them except me. I was going to catch them some time. Particularly, they were my carp. I actually started wandering along the bank in that direction, and then, when I'd gone about 10 yards, I turned back. It meant crashing your way through a kind of jungle of brambles and rotten brushwood, and I was dressed up in my Sunday dress. Dark gray suit, bowler hat, button boots, and collar that almost cut my ears off. That was how people dressed for Sunday afternoons, walks in those days, and I wanted Elsie very bad. I went back and stood over her for a moment. She was lying on the grass with her arms over her face, and she didn't stir when she heard me come. In her black dress she looked, I didn't know how, kind of soft, kind of yielding, as though her body was a kind of malleable stuff that you could do what you liked with. She was mine, and I could have her. This minute, if I wanted to. Suddenly, I stopped being frightened. I chucked my hat on the grass. It bounced, I remember, knelt down and took hold of her. I can smell the wild peppermint, yes. It was my first time, but it wasn't hers, and we didn't make such a mess of it as you might expect. So that was that. A big carp faded out of my mind again, and in fact, for years afterwards, I hardly thought about them. 1913, 1914, the spring of 1914. First the blackthorn, then the hawthorn, and then the chestnuts in blossom. Sunday afternoons along the towpath, and the wind rippling, and beds of rushes on that they swayed, all together in great thick masses, and looked somehow like a woman's hair. The endless June evenings, the path under the chestnut trees, an owl hooting somewhere in Elsie's body against me. It was a hot July that year. How we sweated in the shop, and how the cheese and the ground coffee smelt, and then the cool of the evening outside, the smell of night stock and pipe tobacco, in the lane behind the aliments, the soft dust underfoot, and the night jars hawking after the cockchafers. Christ, what's the use of saying that one ought to be sentimental about before the war? I'm sentimental about it. So are you if you remember it. It's quite true that if you look back on any special period of time, you tend to remember the pleasant bits. That's true even of the war. But it was also true that people then had something that we haven't got now. What? It was simply that they didn't think of the future as something to be terrified of. It isn't that life was softer than that is now. Actually, it was harsher. People on the whole worked harder, lived less comfortably, and died more painfully. The farmhands worked frightful hours for 14 shillings a week and ended up as worn-out cripples with a 5-shilling old age pension and an occasional half-crown from the parish. And what was called respectable poverty was even worse. When little Watson, a small draper at the end of the High Street, failed after years of struggling, his personal assets were £2, 9 shillings, and 6 pence, and he died almost immediately of what was called gastric trouble, but the doctor let it out that it was starvation. Yet he'd clung to his frock coat to the last. Old Crimp, the watchmaker assistant, a skilled workman who been at the job, man and boy, for 50 years, got cataract and had to go into the workhouse. His grandchildren were howling in the street when they took him away. His wife went out charing and by desperate efforts managed to send him a shilling a week for pocket money. He saw ghastly things happen sometimes, small business sliding down the hill, solid tradesmen turning gradually into broken down bankrupts, people dying by inches of cancer and liver diseases, drunken husbands singing in the pledge over every Monday and breaking it every Saturday, girls ruined for life by an illegitimate baby. The houses had no bathrooms. You broke the ice in your basin on winter mornings. The back streets stank like the devil in hot weather, and the churchyard was bang in the middle of the town, so that you never went a day without remembering how you got to the end. And yet, what was it that people had in those days? A feeling of security, even when they weren't secure. More exactly, it was a feeling of community. All of them knew they'd got to die, and I suppose a few of them knew that they were going to go bankrupt. But what they didn't know was that the order of things could change. Whether you might think happened to themselves, things would go on as they'd known them. I don't believe it made very much difference that what's called religious belief was still prevalent in those days. It's true that nearly everyone went to church, at any rate in the country. Elsie and I still went to church as a matter of course, even when we were living in what was Vicar would have called sin. And if you asked people whether they believed in life after death, they generally answered that they did. But I've never met anyone who got me that impression of really believing in a future life. I think that most people believe in the kind of thing in the same way as kids believe in Father Christmas. But it's precisely in a settled period, a period when civilization seems to stand on its four legs like an elephant, that some people as a future life don't matter. Things as a future life don't matter. Let me repeat. But it's precisely in a settled period, a period when civilization seems to stand on its four legs like an elephant, that such things as a future life don't matter. It's easily enough to die if the things you care about are going to survive. You've had your life, you're getting tired, and it's time to go underground. That's how people used to see it. Individually, they were finished, but their way of life would continue. The good and evil would remain good and evil. They didn't feel the ground they stood on shifting under their feet. Father was failing, and he didn't know it. It was merely that times were very bad. Trade seemed to dwindle and dwindle. His bills were harder and harder to meet. Thank God he never even knew that he was ruined. Never actually went bankrupt because he died very suddenly. It was influenza that turned into pneumonia. At the beginning of 1915, to the end, he believed that with thrift, hard work, and fair dealing, a man can't go wrong. There must have been plenty of small shopkeepers who carried that belief not merely to bankrupt deathbeds, but even into the workhouse. Even Lovegrove, the saddler, with cars and motor vans starting him in the face, didn't realize that he was out of date as the rhinoceroses. And father too. Mother never lived to know that the life she'd been brought up to, the life of a decent, good, God-fearing shopkeeper's daughter and a decent, God-fearing shopkeeper's wife in the region of good Queen Vic, was finished for her. Times were different, and trade was bad. Father was worried, and this and that was aggravating. But you carried on much the same as usual. The old English order of life couldn't change, for ever and ever, decent, God-fearing woman would cook Yorkshire pudding and apple dumplings on enormous coal ranges, wear woolen underclothes and sleep on feathers, make plum jam in July and pickles in October, and read Hilda's Home Companion in the afternoons, with the flies buzzing around in a sort of cozy little underworld of stewed tea, bad legs, and happy endings. I didn't say that either father or mother was quite the same in the end. There was a bit shaken and sometimes a little dispirited, but at least they never lived to know that everything they believed in was just so much junk. They lived at the end of an epoch when everything was dissolved into a sort of ghastly flux, and they didn't know it. They thought it was eternity. You couldn't blame them. That was what it felt like. Then came the end of July, and even Lower Binfield grasped that things were happening. For days there was tremendous vague excitement and endless leading articles in the papers, which father actually thought brought in from the shop to read aloud to mother. And then suddenly the posters everywhere. German ultimatum. France mobilizing. For several days, 4 days, wasn't it? I forgot the exact dates. There was a strange, stiffened feeling, a kind of waiting hush, like a moment before a thunderstorm breaks, as though the whole of England was silent and listening. It was very hot, I remember. In the shop it was though we couldn't work, though already enough in the neighborhood who had 5 bob to spare was rushing in to buy quantities of tinned stuff and flour and oatmeal. It was as if we were too feverish to work. We only sweated and waited. In the evening people went down to the railway station and fought like devils over the evening papers which arrived on the London train. And then one afternoon a boy came rushing down the high street with an armful of papers, and the people were coming into the doorways to shout across the street. Everyone was shouting, "We've come in! We've come in!" The boy grabbed a poster from his bundle and stuck it on the shop front opposite. "England declares war on Germany." We rushed out to the pavement, all 3 assistants, and cheered. Everyone was cheering, yes, cheering, but old Grimmett, though he'd already done pretty well out of the war scare, still held on a little of his liberal principles, didn't hold with the war, and said it wouldn't be bad for business. 2 months later, I was in the army. 7 months later, I was in France. And thus ends the reading of George Orwell's Coming Up for Air. Hope you enjoyed. Next, we will read Part 2, Chapter 8. And that was a long chapter.